Welcome, everybody. Um, Welcome, Lori and Barbara. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Mike Arauz. For anyone out there watching who doesn't know me already, I'm one of the founding partners at August Public Inc. We are an independent organizational development firm, and I'm really excited to be joined by you, Barbara and Laurie, and talk about this today. We're going to be talking about a new playbook that was put out by VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab at Stanford University, a board culture playbook. And part of the reason why I was so excited about this when I first saw it come out, and why I was eager to talk to you about it, is because I think so many of the lessons and insights about this are so widely applicable to all teams, but certainly to senior leadership teams. And it's the lessons are not limited to the boardroom. So we'll dig into that. But before we do, I'd love to hear a little bit from each of you. Tell us about who you are and tell us about your connection to this playbook and this work. Let's start with you, Laurie, and then we'll come to you, Barbara.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thank you for having this conversation today. I'm really looking forward to it. So my name is Lori Nishiura Mackenzie. I am the co-founder of the Stanford VMware Lab that Mike introduced me as, the longest title that there ever was. And I am also the executive editor of this playbook. And I am thrilled to be at the intersection of August and my good friend and colleague, Barbara Adachi, who I know is introducing herself next. And just a little background about the lab. We want to do foundational research that helps understand the barriers to inclusive organizations, and then to provide tools that help well-intentioned change agents use an empirical approach to change. We call it a small wins approach to change. And we don't believe small means it's not impactful. What we mean is to take one area, figure out what the barriers are, address them, and create change that builds momentum over time. And this playbook has that thread going throughout it. So what brought me to the playbook is working with the California Partners Project, which is a nonprofit founded by California's first partner, Jennifer Siebel Newsom. And the number of women on boards has increased dramatically in California and in the world. And we wanted to figure out a way to help boards harness the power of the diversity on boards. And so this topic is both important to me from a research perspective, but also personally thinking about who I want to run the companies, the most powerful seats in the world. I'd love to see them run well by a diverse group of people.
Thank you. Barbara.
Oh, thank you, Mike and Laurie. That was fabulous. My name is Barbara Adachi. And I'm a retired partner from Deloitte Consulting. And in my prior career, I had a couple of really amazing roles that kind of led me to where I am today in terms of both board service and then really passionate around this topic. So at Deloitte, I led our national human capital consulting practice for both the US, Mexico, and India. And in addition to that, one of my real passionate roles there was leading the Women's Initiative, which Deloitte launched in 1993, but I was really there for the entire journey, and it was an honor to serve in that role and really look at how to advance women in both the organization and also externally. And then now I'm a retired partner, as I said, and I serve on 3 corporate boards, but I'm very involved with Ascend Pinnacle. And Ascend is the largest network of Asian American professionals in the US, and I lead the board practice, which we have about 200 to 300 members of this particular group. And this is all about advancing, again, as Laurie said, Asian representation in corporate boardrooms through both research and knowledge sharing, and then also just our community itself and really supporting one another and getting there. So this is something very important to me. I'm a big fan of both playbooks that Laurie has and her team have produced, but this one in particular, because I think board culture is so important and a driver of what happens in the boardroom. It's really, I'd say, the foundation of having an effective board.
Thank you so much. Let's keep going with that and digging into this playbook. What needs to change about the current state of boards and board culture?
Well, maybe I could start, and then
Yeah,
Laura, you could
please.
jump in. I don't know that board culture needs to change entirely. I think we just need to kind of draw it out. And I think what the playbook has done, which I love, is it's made it very easy. The simple steps that are in there, Lori talks about small wins. These aren't monumental, like transformational culture changes that boards are going to say, oh, I don't know if we could do that. They're really about the small steps that each of us could take to really bring up the right conversation, invite the right people into that conversation, and then really being able to talk about the value that each individual brings. So I think what needs to change is really the openness around kind of having everybody have a voice at the table. It's one thing to get everybody in the door and invited in to join a board, but then it's another one to be inclusive and to be able to be open to those conversations.
That
Yeah.
was really great, Barbara. And I just want to add, when we started this project with the California Partners Project, we interviewed dozens of directors. And so a lot of the practices you see are what really good boards do already. And sometimes the challenge is they're not always done consistently. And some boards don't know about the best practices that are happening on other boards. So what we wanted to do was make the good practices widely available so that any board that might not feel like they're harnessing the power of everyone on their team can just pull the pieces through that they would like to improve on. And also what we noticed is for first-time board members, and there are a lot of first-time board members, whether they're cybersecurity experts, whether they're market experts, whatever expertise they're bringing to the board, they might not understand the dynamics of the board as they're starting. So by making those dynamics clearer and more, I guess, transparent and easier to follow, we're not only helping the overall board, but we're especially helping people who are joining their first board.
Yeah. Thank you. I want to dig in a little bit more on the inclusion aspect of this, the inclusion focus of what you've created. Sadly, I would say DEI is often, in diversity, equity, inclusion broadly, is sadly being marginalized a lot. And, it's like this extra thing that like, yeah, we should do it, but like happens over there. And one of the things I loved about this playbook is that it does a great job of centering inclusion as not just like this extra nice thing to have, but rather it is central to high functioning, high performing, effective teams and effective boards. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about like how do you think about like what is inclusion? What are we talking about when we talk about it in inclusion, and why is inclusion so valuable?
I can start with this one, Barbara, if that's all right. As
Absolutely.
we were creating the playbook, we even debated whether to include the strategy or not. And as we spoke to directors, they were the ones who informed us that inclusion is critical on their teams. And to think about an inclusion mindset, so an inclusion mindset might be, how do we harness the value of people here versus just expecting them to show up? And one man said this is helpful because he gets pigeonholed into being the tech expert. And without inclusion, he's not often asked to participate in other conversations. So inclusion as a mindset not only helps us think about who's at the table, who's not at the table, who does our company target, who does our company not include, how's the culture of the organization we're having governance over, but also to think about its membership more broadly. So for us, this inclusion mindset became essential as we crafted these strategies for the playbook.
Yeah.
I love that, Lori. And I think if I could just take it a step
Hmm.
further on the boards that I've served on and currently serve on, I think inclusion from a very tactical standpoint is really very intentional. And I believe that it's around, and I think in the playbook we talk about having like this safe zone, a place where people can really speak up and have the transparency that we want to have within the boardroom. When you take it outside, that's one step different. But today in the boardroom itself, I think some of the best practices out there that are in the playbook are around, making know that everyone feel like they belong at the table. And that's kind of a very tactical thing in terms of whether you do a round robin or you just make sure that you intentionally include people in the conversation, but it's more than just being invited to speak, but your opinion is valued. And it doesn't mean there needs to be a consensus. So inclusion does not mean
Right.
we have to have unanimity, like everybody has to agree to this. It's more around having the discussion and the debate and making sure that all opinions are valued. So I think, it's very, very intentional. But I think, I think the thing that I've learned along the way, being Asian myself, is that the terms around, or maybe like you said, Mike, it's no longer kind of like at the forefront, and it's almost got some negative connotation right now, but it's really around back to the culture piece and back to the feeling of belonging. When we select a new board member, and I'm on 2 nom-gov committees, we don't go around, oh, well, that person is this, and they're also Asian, or they're also Black. It's really around, we don't say that around Caucasians. Oh, they're all, we really talk more around, do they fit? Do they fit in the culture? How do you see yourself at the table with them? What do they bring from a skill set? What Lori just referred to, but at the same time, we don't lead with that. So it's really, I think we have to get out of the like labeling a little bit and really just thinking about, the inclusiveness as a whole, and not even having to use that word, but again, it's reflective of how things happen in the room or how the discussions actually take place.
Yeah, absolutely. I love all of that. And it rings so true with what we see in our client work and the work that we do to help teams become great teams. And one of the principles that the way that we describe it is just making it easy for people to contribute, regardless of who they are or where they might sit in the team or in the organization. And I think it's so the connection to performance, high performance, I come back to the fundamental principles of adaptivity and agility, because in adaptivity science, it's about variation and selection, right? We need to try a lot of stuff, see what works, and then keep doing more of that on purpose. But you got to try a lot of different stuff. And the complex problems, these very hard to predict, hard to plan for problems that boards are tasked with solving, or a senior leadership team is tasked with solving, the right answers are not obvious.
Yeah.
And we have to try different things. So it's so important to make sure that we're making it easy for people who have a different perspective on something to share that, put it on the table so that we can give it a try.
I like
Um,
that.
I want to talk a little bit more about the norms piece. So like you were describing, Lori, this playbook is really practical. And I think as you said, Barbara, we're giving teams really specific, easy, making it easy for them to start. One of the practices that you talk about is building inclusive norms. And I was wondering if you could just share some of the examples, like what are some good inclusive norms, and how are those different from kind of the default way that most teams might work?
That's a great question. I'll kick off, Barbara, about how we created it. And Barbara was part of the team that helped us think of what to include in it. So one of the things we noticed about norms is that in general, teams are more comfortable getting consensus than seeking the dissent. And what you're talking about, Mike, is those moments when maybe we're 90% in the right direction, but that 10% needs to be brought up. Are our dynamics set up to really get to that 10%? And a lot of boards let us know what they worry about is groupthink, that the group is just going to all agree with the first thing that was said. And then the person who's not sure if what was said was exactly right might not speak up. So some of the norms are around what I call encouraging dissent. So for example, having before the meeting a discussion of the key points and intentionally soliciting all of the views and ensuring that during the meeting, the discussion covers all of the views during that discussion. And then another norm is after the meeting, when the chair might be debriefing how the meeting went, to include in those questions, how did the meeting dynamics go? So that we have an ongoing conversation about how to get the best ideas to the table. So those were just two of the ones that came to mind. Barbara, I'll let you share more from your view.
Well, that's exactly, I would love reading this. And by the way, when I participated with Lori, we had a panel about a month or so ago. The playbook had not been published yet. I had kind of seen a preview of it, but I was really excited because there was a lot of consistency with what all of the interviews had pointed to in terms of what's going on. On one of my boards, this pre-meeting idea is really effective. We actually call it another executive session where there are no management members in the room. And our chair in that situation not only goes around the room to make sure we hear from everybody, but also assigns things that are going to come up in the big meeting. Like, Barbara, you made a point around here. Why don't you own that? And when this comes up in the bigger meeting with the management team and other guests or speakers, that you might want to cover this. So then you get a little bit more comfortable knowing what you're going to say, because especially for a first-time board member, and in this case, I'm not that first-time board member, but I see this in common with others. You know, they feel more comfortable knowing they have a speaking part versus like, I'm not going to say anything right away because it might be the wrong thing. Whereas you have first kind of a place to rehearse it, I would say, or really voice it. And then, and when it's valid or needs to be made in the bigger meeting, we go in with that. So I find that to be really effective. And it's been something that we adopted about 2 or 3 years ago. And everybody now really would understand that we're going to go in. We're going to also understand, as Lori pointed out, where we don't agree and the things that, you know, and kind of get that out in the open. But we don't go into the room with like, don't ever say we don't agree. But we do have this concept of what I would say one voice, and it's actually written into what we call our code of conduct, that we have the debate and everybody's voice is heard and respected. But when we leave the room, we're united. We're not going to say, well, I actually thought this, even though so-and-so wanted to do that. We don't do that. So that's kind of an understood, and that's kind of part of our culture that's been built over time, is that all of that debate and dissent takes place in the room. But when we leave the room, we are united in terms of what the decision was.
That's great. Those are so helpful. And that experience you were describing, Laurie, of like somebody being hesitant to speak up. We see this all the time at teams of all, you know, up and down the hierarchy, where somebody hesitates to speak up, not actually because they are afraid of the response or they feel like the team doesn't want or doesn't value hearing a dissenting opinion, but even just because they're afraid it will derail things, that it'll block things or slow things down, and they just don't want to be a blocker. And so, yeah, a norm, you know, one of the ways that we describe that norm that you were talking about, Laurie, is we have a principle or a commitment that, like, we commit to move things forward, not when we all agree that it's the best thing, but rather when no one has a reason why it's not safe to try. And that is the official bar that we're looking for before we commit to things. The practices you were just describing overlap a lot with good meeting practices, and that's another one of the tools that you have in this toolkit around great meeting practices. Certainly, you know, so many people and leadership teams have meeting overload, right? It's way too many. The whole calendar day is full of meetings. You don't even know why you're in them or what they're trying to accomplish. So you have a whole section about this. What are some of your favorite tips and most important things for facilitating and running better meetings?
Do you want me to start, Barbara, or do you want to start this one?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. One of my favorite tactics for effective meetings is what's called framing the conversation. And what that basically means is oftentimes we just start doing the work. And as a leader, it's really important to frame the work that's wanting to happen, but also what the work is for. Because we might all think this is to solve this one problem, but it's bigger than the framework I walked into. And if the leader doesn't take a moment to frame it in that way, often the conversation isn't as effective and sometimes not as inclusive either. And so on a leadership team, not on a board team, in a leadership interview I heard that one leader always clarifies there's only certain kinds of meetings. One is a listen meeting. You're just here to listen, take notes, and have it inform what you're doing. 2, it's a information gathering meeting We want to hear as much information from as diverse perspectives as possible. And 3, it might be a decision-making meeting. By the end of the meeting, we're going to make a decision. Therefore, in advance, bring all of your ideas. That simple framework really helps the people in the room know how to listen and participate, but also how to prepare. And without that, you could imagine if I'm going to what I think is a decision-making meeting and people are just talking at me, because it's a sharing meeting, that it could be very frustrating. And on boards, the framing, of course, has different frames that were effective, but taking the time to do that can make a huge difference in groups.
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, one of the things that boards are known for, if you've talked to a lot of board members, is a lot of times there's just volumes of paper to read before you go to. I talk. There's like 300 pages in this deck, and people are just overwhelmed with information. So a lot of this kind of framing that Lori's talking about actually happens before the actual meeting takes place. So one of the things that one of my boards has adopted is that I think is really helpful is an executive summary. It's just 2 pages. To Lori's point, it says, is this an approval meeting? Do we have to vote on anything, or are we just getting information? And I think that that is really helpful going into knowing we're not making a decision today, or we don't need to have a board vote. We're going to have a board vote at the next meeting, so we're preparing you today. But this executive summary, what I like about it, it not only summarizes what the key issues are, but it also talks about the impact on stakeholders. So it tells us for all of the stakeholders in this particular company, is it kind of neutral? Is it an upside? Is it a downside? And then what are the risks? So I find this particular summary to be something that I really look at. And then I look at all of the material behind it with a very different lens than if I just got a ton of information saying, what am I supposed to do with this? The other thing that I've seen happen, especially now with this capability that we have like today and being able to do things virtually, is we try to take some parts of the meeting and do it in advance. And so we can actually spend the meeting talking more about strategy and the decisions that we make, and anything that we could do ahead of time, or we could maybe move some committee meetings to Zoom or some other venue where we don't have to always be in person, because I think it's like you said, Mike, meeting overload. And these board meetings usually span 2 to 3 days. So if you're in meetings constantly, by the end, you're not even, really engaging in the same way that you were on day one. So I think we're trying to kind of not so much shorten the days, but also make it more impactful in the meeting itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. A lot of what you're talking about is getting really smart about the work that needs to be done in this particular moment, right? This piece of work needs this group of people, and this is the right time and place for it. This other work, talking about big ideas and strategy, needs a different space and a different time. And we should be really intentional about designing those moments.
Exactly.
And Laurie, what you were saying, that that idea of there are certain meeting types. Is it a decision meeting? Is it a collaboration meeting? Is it a brainstorming meeting? That that really resonates for us. And I think that there's something that can also be helpful to add on to that is also thinking of those, in addition to being smart about how those might be different meetings, you can also think about those as different modes within a meeting. And if you get really smart about that, because inevitably something is going to bubble up in the middle of the meeting, and you'll be like, we should talk about this. But you can still be smart about what's the right mode to talk about this particular subject. Oh, this thing that just bubbled up, I have a proposal and I would really like to get advice on it. So we should go into the advice mode in our meeting practice and use the right tools to do that. Something that we use all the time, and I saw it in your playbook as well, is the idea of rounds, or inviting each person to speak one at a time in turn without interrupting each other, and having that as one of the specific go-to practices and to make our meetings better. And you can even break that out and say, there's a clarifying question round to give people a chance to make sure that they understand everything. And separate from that, there can be a reaction round where we hear, each person's piece of advice or thoughts on that. Anything else that you wanted to add on the meeting practices?
I love that round idea so much, Mike, and it came up also on in our interviews. And one of the norms people can also set is that if you don't have something additive, you don't have to be that awkward person who says, I agree with everything that's been said. There's no negative reaction to somebody saying, I'm going to pass it this time as well. So even being able to pass without feeling like, oh gosh, am I not contributing, can be a very inclusive way to run a meeting as well.
Yeah. One question for both of you, this came up, just crossed my mind. You talk about the facilitation kind of as a skill, right? But I'm wondering, did it come up, the idea of facilitator as a designated role within the meeting, and even potentially the facilitator role being maybe separate from the most senior person, or being intentionally separated from other key roles that were present. Did that come up, or how did it come up in your conversations?
I can start. I think that might be one of the differences from what I understand, what happens in board meetings and what happens on leadership teams. Because in many of the board meetings, only people in the room might be the people who are on the board, because the information gathered could be quite confidential in nature. However, what might have come up is similar to what you're saying, is that the chair does not always have to, in every setting, facilitate all the conversations that's happening. In fact, sometimes the CEO facilitates some of the conversation, right? Yeah. Sometimes the chair, and different sections might be assigned to different kinds of people. I think what that results in is the role modeling of good facilitation needs to really be part of the board practice, so that whoever is leading a part of the session engages in the good practices. And so I think, riffing off what you're saying, maybe when a different person is facilitating, the person who facilitates a different part can observe what's working and not working. And I think that's one of the values of not always being the facilitator, is that you can see that perhaps some of the practices you're doing aren't as good as what this other person's doing, and then try to learn from others on the boards, which are boards of peers, much more than they are hierarchical, like in many leadership teams.
Yeah.
I would agree. I think in the boardroom, there's a slightly different dynamic. First of all, it's a much smaller group in most cases. And if you get into the committee level, like a compensation committee or nominating and governance committee, you're talking like maybe 6 or 7 people in the room. And so the facilitation role usually is with the chair of that committee or the board, but then the intimacy is just different than if you have like a large leadership team, and it's very different when you have the whole management team and the board together, because then you could be talking about 25 people in a room, and really excellent facilitation skills are required for that, just to kind of manage all the moving parts. So I think, to Lori's point, it is, you kind of observe, but I'd say in most situations, what you also don't want to have is just a lot of management presenting. And I think that boards get really frustrated, board members get frustrated when it's just like one way. And so that's why, the whole point of having pre-reads or doing these smaller executive summaries or whatever, is to be able to spend the time we have together, which is limited, to really get to the heart of the issue. And especially if there's any decisions that need to be made or debates that need to happen, it needs to happen live, because once you leave, we don't see each other for another 3 months. And so it's hard to have that dynamic when you're not together. And that's why board culture is just so key to kind of what happens also between meetings, and the kind of communication that happens in between.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah, and I'm absolutely talking about, thinking about not necessarily adding a new external person, but within the group that we have, how are we being intentional about who's stepping into that facilitator role? And I think it's especially important when we're talking about boards and we're talking about senior leadership teams. the facilitator is also facilitating the flow of power and how power shows
Very
up
true.
in that group, right?
Very true.
And sometimes it's useful for someone who's the chair, who's in that formal position of power, to to use that power and use that influence. That's what we want. That's what they're there for. But other times we might want to balance it, right? Like maybe we want to separate that or use their power, invite their power in a more careful or intentional way, because maybe that power might overwhelm hearing from all the other people in the room if we're not careful.
I think it's an interesting dynamic also if you have a board where the chair and the CEO are the same individual versus you have both, and often the independent, chairman is a good thing because then there's more of a balance. And then also a lead director will often have that role if there's a situation where the chair and the CEO are the same. But to your point, Mike, yes, it's really good if you can, because you're right, it could be intimidating and for anybody if they're also if it's something that if for the first time you're vetting it at the same time. So a lot of it is really how much time and transparency you've had in between meetings, so people aren't like, wait, I have to absorb this now, like, versus they had a chance to think about it before they got into the room. And that's why I think facilitation really becomes important to kind of draw that out, especially in kind of an urgent situation. What we just had this issue that came up, we've got to deal with it now. How do they really, get everyone in the room to kind of weigh in a constructive way?
Yeah, thank you for that.
I'll add one other note I heard about power. So some directors like Barbara are on multiple boards. I speak to some venture capitalists who are on 20 boards of their startups. And then there might be the person who is a first-time board member, and it took them 7 years to get their first board seat. And you can imagine for that person, it's a big deal how they are perceived. It can feel like a big deal for them. Very high pressure that they're always adding value, because for many of them, this is an on-ramp to having more of a career as a director, right? So you could imagine for that person, using power well as a chair is really important to ensure that this person that you spent maybe 3 years interviewing is actually doing the value add that you're hoping they can do. And from their perspective, the pressure to always perform can be quite high. So we heard that as well from first-time board members, the desire to not only add value, but to be known as adding value. And that's, to your point, Mike, of having power be used well can be very important.
Yeah. It relates a little bit to, I think this will be the last of my questions, and we'll check in to see if you have any other thoughts that you want to share. You talk about learning to engage with and value differences. And this is so important, such an important thing for leaders, especially. And I'd love to hear a little bit about what are some of the challenges that leaders have with developing that skill? And what are some of the best ways for leaders to overcome those challenges to learn to engage with and value difference?
As people progress up through the organization, I think one of the things we don't realize is that sometimes our peer set can be more homogenous. And we might not realize that we aren't hearing from all sorts of views. So our meeting norms might not have to be as intentional in rooms where maybe we've worked together for a long time and we have similar backgrounds. We've all been in tech, for example, and our product's doing really well. In those situations, the stakes around differences can feel quite low. And so what I love about being somebody who is, Asian American, and a woman who has many elements of difference from typical leaders, is I can often see dynamics and opportunities that perhaps people who don't have my experience can't see. So when we crafted this idea of valuing differences, we realized one of the challenges is if you're used to things running a certain way and they seem to be running well, there can almost be a, if it's not broken, don't fix it kind of approach to it. And yet, when we ask people who maybe haven't been in those seats of power before, what do you observe? Their insights might be really valuable. So what we tried to do is give a simple and practical way to do this. We call it perspective taking. So perspective taking is really cognitive empathy. It's the idea of asking open-ended questions to get the perspective of another, at first without judgment. And it's really hard because if you listen to your head, often you're saying, well, that's not what I meant, or gosh, that doesn't work. So sometimes perspective taking means asking a couple questions. How did the meeting go for you? How did you experience it? What parts of the meeting went really well? What part made it hard for people to contribute? Maybe you, maybe others. What's a practice you see that helps us do better? And just listen without debate. And once we have perspective taking, you can appreciate this view. You don't have to do everything, but if it ends in appreciation, that means we really have value differences. And so perspective taking is a tool that many people, including boards, can use to harness the value of those differences instead of maybe going with what's comfortable or has been normal in the past.
I think the other thing I was going to just add, and those are absolutely great ideas. I have to say, I don't always see that in the boardroom. I don't, in being new in some of my boards haven't seen exactly that, and I'm hoping they all adopt the playbook going forward. But I would say that, one of the studies that I saw, and I think this is very true, that effective boards and effective leaders not only act in that manner, but they also spend time together outside of the boardroom. And I think that that's where you start to see the person versus just them as another board member. And I'm not talking socially, I all the time, but I just think the time in between, and that's why I think these longer board meetings where you do have multiple days, you have a time to do a board dinner, you have time to get to know people one-on-one, you do have time to kind of mix the tables up a little bit so you intentionally get to know others besides what they're saying in the boardroom and start to value them as an individual, what their background is, where they came from, and recognize that their experience could be very different from yours. I think the other thing too is when you get to the boardroom, no matter what your role is, even if you're just serving on committees, we all have to kind of step up as that leader. We have to take that initiative to get to know people, ask them how they thought the meeting went, and not just think that the chair or the committee chair is the one that's going to go and do that. And so I think by gathering that information on your own and being proactive around it will also help break barriers and maybe perceptions about you, like, oh, she's new, so she's not going to ask anything, or something else, or he's new and he's only he wants to hang around the people he already knows. If you don't take that initiative yourself individually as a board member, then you can't just wait for it to happen. So I would say that leadership is on everybody's shoulders and responsibility.
I
Thank
love
you.
that, Barbara. And could I add one of the exercises someone shared with us that his board does that achieves what Barbara said is so personal about building those relationships. So they noticed at the board dinner that people kind of just chit-chatted and weren't doing the work to get to know each other deeper. So what they did was assigned a table host and asked that table host to share about something they're passionate about that's not related to board work. And he likes to fence. So in his table, he talked about it and also how that relates to how he thinks about leadership. And that got people to know him so much more, but then he got to know people because they started talking to him about something that was not kind of below, that was beyond the surface talk. And so just even doing that with intention over and over again really created this cohesion, not built on similarities, but built on deeply understanding each other. And I just thought that was a great idea.
That's great. A question that we used, we hosted a private dinner maybe 2 months ago or 1 month ago. And a check-in question that we used was, what is something that you wish you knew a lot more about? And it was so fun to start the conversation that way, because people shared all kinds of interests and passions that they had. Some work related, but a lot of things that were outside the bounds of work. Yeah, and those questions that you were sharing before, Laurie, are so, I really want to emphasize them. How did the meeting go for you? What was something that went well in the meeting? Where was a place you got stuck? And having that specific language is so helpful for leaders. And I also, uh, I think I have to keep reminding myself that it is so much harder than I think it is for anybody, including leaders, to actually say those questions, to ask those questions and let somebody else answer it, right? Like, no one wants to just like let the questions sit out there. And it can be a little bit easier, I think, by framing it a little bit. You can say to the person, I'm so glad that you're part of this team. I really want to get to know your perspective a little bit better. So I have a couple of questions. Can I ask you them? It might seem a little bit direct, but I really am interested in hearing your answers. Something like that can make it a little bit easier. Wonderful. Well, we're almost done. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to hear any closing thoughts from each of you. And is there a question that you wished I had asked you, and what's your answer to that? Barbara, why don't you start us off, and then we'll go to Laurie.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mike. This has been a fascinating conversation. I always love to be with Laurie because she's got such great ideas. I can't think of anything you didn't ask. I would like to just say that I believe that I'm just passionate about board culture. And I think that the more inclusive we are, the more people are going to feel like they fit. And I think, we underestimate this. When you're doing a board interview to get on a board, it's a very different dynamic because we're looking at just skill sets predominantly, and other aspects maybe regionally where people are based, or if they've had industry experience in the same industry that the company is in. But I think when you get into the room, it's not always easy to have that conversation that you're just talking about as both a board member and as a leader within the boardroom. So I would just say that my advice would be to not be afraid to ask the questions. I'm a big about not waiting to be asked. As you were saying, that how difficult it is sometimes for leaders to kind of find their way to do this. It may not come natural to them. So I think we each have to be an advocate to help each other feel that inclusiveness that we want to feel. We have to demonstrate that sense of belonging and bring people in just as we want to be brought in. And I think if we each were to do that as individual board members, that would start to change the culture inside, or even enhance the culture. I'm not saying the culture is good or bad. I'm just saying by building that inclusive culture, you have to be very proactive and intentional.
I love that word you used, Barbara, of proactive, proactive and intentional, because most of great cultures don't happen by accident. They happen by intention, as you said. And Mike, I agree. There weren't any questions I wish you asked. I just want to end with saying my ultimate dream, my ultimate reason for doing this playbook is that board culture and the intentional building of it could just be the new normal. That to get the best out of people, we need to engage with either tools like the playbook, with experts like Barbara, who've done this in their work over the years she was at Deloitte with the Women's Initiative, with groups like August, who have all these frameworks. There's so many ways that boards can learn how to intentionally build a great culture. And I'd love for it to become the new normal, that this is just what you do. It's part of board engagement, and doing it well will make our organizations, our company, and our society stronger. And that's the ultimate reason why I did the playbook, and I hope people give it a whirl, give it a try.